Hello, welcome back to Laughing Through the Pain, Navigating Wellness with me, Richard L. Blake, co-host Andy Esam, and today we have Alex Manos, who is one of the few Institute for Functional Medicine certified practitioners in the UK. He has a master's degree in personalised nutrition, for which he completed his dissertation on cortisol resistance in chronic fatigue syndrome. And Alex also has a first-class degree in nutritional therapy and is the co-founder of Health Path, a company I liked so much I crowdfunded them. So that's definitely a stamp of approval. Welcome, Alex.
Thank you, guys. It's nice to be on the other end of the mic for a change.
That's right. I've been on Alex's podcast, the Health Path podcast, a couple of times talking about breathwork. So yeah, now we're going to be grilling Alex as hard as he went for me. No, you'll see, Alex is a very nice and gentle practitioner. I think there was another biohacker who listens to your podcast, and we were talking about you and saying you have a nice, more gentle, less biohackery, like, this is the one supplement that is going to change your life, and don't listen to anyone else because I'm the only right guy, and buy my supplement, sign up to my 6-week program. Alex is much more balanced, so I think you'll like that.
Thank you.
Yes. Andy, how are you doing?
Yeah, I'm good, thanks, mate. I'm still whinging about my jet lag 5 days later. The one thing I'm resistant to at the moment is exercise. I think I've done everything else, but it might have to be exercise now. I'm facing up to that reality.
Yeah, I think exercise at the time of day that you least want to do it is probably the best thing to do. So yeah, Andy and I were talking about this off air, but I think for him going from US to UK, exercising first thing in the morning outside in the sunlight would be great. Whereas if it was me coming back to California, exercising later at night would help more.
Even if there isn't any sunlight?
Even if there isn't any sunlight, cloud light, yeah. Alex, any hacks for jet lag? Is that probably not your area of specialty?
I was speaking with the director of the Earthing Institute in California, and anecdotally, earthing has been found to be incredibly helpful for jet lag, and there's something they think around the resonance of the electrons that you're taking up from the ground in that time zone actually helping with the whole sort of resynchronization, which is pretty fascinating.
Oh, amazing. All right, maybe
exercising barefoot first thing in the morning, even when it's raining. There you
Blimey.
go.
Okay.
Yeah. Barefoot, or there are like earth shoes as well, EARTE, earth runners as well. They have like a conductive strap, so they're like sandals that look like sandals. And then I also have groundlings, I think they're called groundies, and they just look like Havaianas, but they have a little metal strip that helps conduct that electricity. So earthing, listener, is where you are picking up the Schumann resonance, which is a frequency that the earth emits from itself. And that's interesting that you get different Schumann resonances, I guess, in different parts of the world.
I think Gator was just saying that the electrons are going to be vibrating at a certain frequency. And I might be butchering this a little bit, but that's the general message he gave. And that's going to be partly determined based on location and the spectrum of light that is being received by that part of Earth at that point in time, etc. So yeah, try it out maybe.
Yeah.
Will do. My last experience with grounding was I went out of our little cabin in Sedona with Rich, and then when I turned around, I pierced my foot on a massive cactus.
So on a spike. It's a
I'm building up my next attempt. London might be safer, perversely.
Yes.
Anyway.
Yeah. Well, you can walk barefoot in your suit to the tube to work. Yeah.
Okay. Well, Alex, it's good to meet you.
Likewise.
I suppose just for my benefit, what's your story? Like, what got you interested in nutrition, biohacking, etc.?
Yeah, my story, we kind of have to go back to almost day one, to be honest. So I, from a very young age, we're talking sort of a few weeks, certainly a few months, had terrible eczema to the point that mum apparently would walk into the bedroom in the morning and I'd have blood on my skin all over just from itching myself all night. So really from a very young age, there was, let's just call it compromised health. Something was going on immune, inflammatory wise on my skin. And then when I was 5 or 6, I was at school. And as you do at that age, I went to the toilet, went for number 1, pulled down my shorts to the ankles and actually had a sort of explosive diarrhea. And then found myself walking through the school rather stained. And this was I don't have a really strong memory of it. It's a very faint memory, but obviously I've been told it by my mum. And she says from that day onwards, I refused to go and have a poo at school. So after not that long, obviously became constipated. With my kind of, I guess, current knowledge, speculate that I started to lose sensitivity to needing a bowel movement ultimately, which I think is quite common, especially with those struggling with constipation. And then it sort of escalated from there. And to cut a long story short, was diagnosed with IBS, irritable bowel syndrome, when I was 18, but had symptoms that sort of peaked and troughed from sort of 5-6 years old through to 18. They really peaked when I was 18 in my last year at secondary school. It was a period when I was doubled over in pain. I was napping 2 hours a day in the afternoon when all my friends were out playing sports. So there was a degree of fatigue, brain fog, skin issues were still there. And then I kind of got on with it, to be honest. It got to a point where it sort of settled. I was able to sort of get back into a little bit of sports, energy levels improved a bit, went off to university. I did politics at university. My parents thought it would be a good idea to have some sort of sensible degree. I was fortunate in many ways that when I was about 15, I knew I was going to become a personal trainer. It was like the only thing I could ever see myself doing. So immediately on failing my degree in politics, I went and did a personal trainer diploma. Then I started with the Institute of Optimum Nutrition, which kind of started my nutritional therapy training. And it was during that training that I read Patrick Holford's, one of his books, including his Optimum Nutrition Bible, but he also has a much smaller book on gut health. And over a 4-week period, I kind of followed the book to the letter. I had some gut-focused hypnotherapy, and every single one of my symptoms completely disappeared. Not just gut stuff. I'm talking, I had always been a terrible sleeper, and I was now sleeping all the way through the night without waking up once. Lower back aches from a rugby tackle completely disappeared. Like I just was on a whole new level of health that I had never experienced in my life to that point. Unfortunately, it didn't last. So I kind of went back onto a more diverse diet, and symptoms started to come back. They were a lot better, but they were still very much there. And then that kind of continued into my sort of mid-late 20s when I started doing my master's and started studying with the Institute for Functional Medicine. And I guess a lot of nutritional therapists go on a fairly textbook journey where they're like, I've got it. I know what I'm doing. It's all about nutrition and supplementation and testing. And then, just life progressed, and I realized there was just something else going on with clients. There was a group that I was just not able to help at all. Part of it was behavior change stuff. So I went and did a life coaching diploma, and that helped a little bit. And then I think just through my own existence of feeling like there was a bit of a void in life, I call it, I then stumbled across Michael Pollan's book, How to Change Your Mind. That took me on the whole psychedelic story that people kind of say endlessly these days. I read the book, went to a psychedelic retreat, and my life was changed. And it was on the psychedelic retreat that I'd had my first ever breathwork experience. And off the back of that, I then trained in transformational breath as a way to support clients, because generally speaking, the clients I'm seeing all have some kind of trauma or chronic/acute stress that is absolutely driving some of their symptoms. And I just wanted a tool within my toolkit to help them. So that brings us roughly up to today, I guess, ultimately.
That's all super interesting, and sounds like, really some tough experiences there. And there's so many threads I want to pull on there. But I think it's really interesting that you had issues from such a young age, eczema from day one, and the IBS, because so many sort of therapists, there's that bucket analogy of like, you've got symptoms because you've had years and years of stress, and your symptoms have finally blown over from all your wrong decisions, all the bad foods you've eaten, but you had it from day one. So how do you sort of square that circle?
Yeah, unfortunately, I think that there was something going on for my mum. I was breastfed. So the fact that, my source of food was the milk from my mum suggests to me that there was something going on there that was contributing to it. And interestingly, she has, I would say, a few health issues now, and they all started with that pregnancy. So I'm the younger of two, and I just suspect that there was something going on for my mum health-wise that, let's just say, I inherited, so to speak. Not genetically, obviously, but my food source was potentially compromised. Maybe she was eating something that was actually having an impact on her immune system and her gut. I don't know with any certainty, and I don't feel like I need to. And I think that's one of the really important lessons that I've learned along the way that I sort of teach clients these days, which is we're really told in social media and in the blogosphere, etc., that there is a root cause and we just need to find it and then fix it and you'll be fine. And I would actually say that's quite a rare occurrence where there is a root cause. And I much prefer the concept that, as Rich, you kind of say there's an accumulative wear and tear of living. And that accumulative wear and tear is going to be different based on lifestyle and exposures and upbringings and everything. You know, this concept of the exposome in the research these days, which is literally our lifelong exposure to everything, exogenous and endogenous, which is essentially dictating our current health. So I think from that perspective, you know, the events early on in life, maybe something going on with my mum, the relationship that I developed with food, you know, from a very young age, I must have learned that food drives symptoms. And there were certainly long periods when I was, you know, my mum would giggle at me, really. I'd be standing at the fridge with the door open and then I'd stand there for 20 minutes because I just knew whatever I ate, I was going to react to. And I was just desperate to try and find something that I wasn't going to react to. So I think when we're on these sort of health journeys, it ends up going incredibly deep, kind of into our psyche, ultimately, you know, how we're relating to food, people, experiences. And we might touch on, you know, some of the research around personality traits and IBS, for example, later, which is quite an interesting area. But yeah, that's my long-winded, vague answer, Rich, I guess.
No, that's really interesting. And in the introduction, we heard that you're one of the few Institute for Functional Medicine certified practitioners in the UK. My question is, what is functional medicine and how is it different from sort of regular nutrition or medicine?
Good question, and appropriate, I think, at the moment, because a theme that I'm seeing at the moment is people are starting to really critique functional medicine, especially in the quantum health space. People are using functional medicine as almost the poster child of what to criticize, and they have some validity to it. I think functional medicine promised a lot and touched on this, obviously, and I think it hasn't necessarily delivered on some of that. So functional medicine is, in the UK, you could argue it's called nutritional therapy. I think there is this overlap here, and it is really about trying to understand what are the underlying imbalances that are contributing to someone's symptoms. And they use quite a nice analogy as kind of a tree. So if you have a sick tree, you don't go to the leaves to treat the leaves, you go to the soil and to the roots and you water it, etc. And the roots and the soil for us humans are multiple things. It is things like our upbringing, but it is our genetic predispositions. It's the air we're breathing. It's the exercise we're doing or not doing. It's the diet we're eating. So all of these kind of fundamental, foundational things that contribute to our overall health are often things that are contributing to symptoms. And in conventional medicine, you know, those symptoms will get clustered together and there's an algorithm that will say, okay, when you have these symptoms, you have this diagnosis and this is the medication that you get for this diagnosis. And that's the conventional medicine model. Ultimately, it is symptom management primarily these days when we think of statins and other cholesterol medications, blood pressure medications, etc. So functional medicine is saying, well, let's not operate in the leaves. Let's get to the roots of the issue as best we can. Sometimes it's possible, sometimes it's just not possible, at least not from one lens. And that's where I think, you know, the sort of the biopsychosocial model where we have to consider our psyche, we have to consider the physical stuff of our things like our nutrition and our exercise, that we need to think about our relationships. We need to think about really every area of health and how we're interacting with life as a way to really understand what needs to shift to get back to good health. So that's why they call it kind of root cause medicine. It's trying to get to the root of things ultimately.
Right. I suppose is the reason that perhaps traditional medicine goes for the treating the symptoms, not the causes. Is it a time thing? Because it sounds like this is very multifaceted, and in your own journey, you've gone through so many different kind of exploratory experiments, if you like. It seems like this could take quite a lot of time.
Yeah, and that is one of the criticisms, I think. It's time consuming. It can be money consuming, so to speak, if you go down with some of the functional tests that are available out there. But I think time limitation is one of the reasons why conventional medicine is the way it is. You've got the slightly more cynical sort of, I guess, narrative around who's controlling stuff.
That sounds very rich.
But, I guess, who is benefiting the most from saying these pharmaceuticals are what we need for these conditions, and why are the medical doctors not getting the training around actually lifestyle cause a lot of these things? So I think there is a very appropriate, very valid argument that there's just the way conventional medicine has evolved. The people sort of controlling that narrative are the ones that are benefiting the most from the outcomes that they're recommending. So it's valid. And I think cholesterol is a well understood sort of story there that we won't go into today, but we understand why we have our understanding of cholesterol, I guess, ultimately, from a conventional perspective. And then, conventional medicine, I guess, the third quite common explanation is it was initially created more for life-saving considerations, procedures, and things like this. And now we are at a point in time where the majority of reasons people are going to a doctor are lifestyle-driven conditions. So we've kind of also just, I think, gone for an evolution of the type of issue that a general practitioner is now seeing. That's changed, I guess, to some degree as well. So yeah, there's kind of multiple reasons why, but I think the second one might be significant.
And you mentioned quantum medicine there. Well, it's the first time I've heard that term. What's that?
Quantum biology, quantum health, quantum medicine. It's this, I guess, idea really that light, water, and magnetism are the three main drivers of health or disease in humans. So it comes back, in quantum biology, they talk a lot about the importance of earthing. They talk a lot about full spectrum sunlight and the importance of getting as much of that as possible within, common sense parameters, shall we say. So it's kind of, I would just put it as the new functional medicine. It's the new thing, it seems to me. Dr. Jack Kruse is sort of, I guess, one of the big people in that crowd.
Yeah,
he's
a big personality for sure.
Yes, a big personality. Yeah. Someone I much prefer and I always recommend if people are interested in this area is Carrie Bennett. She's just a wonderful human who is able to explain this stuff in a way that anyone is going to be able to understand it. And I think, Dr. Jack Kruse doesn't try to be that person, quite frankly. So, yeah.
Yeah, he's, I think he's doing some great things, but he's quite cantankerous, and I think doesn't you get along with a lot of people. But yeah, that's interesting. And I've been following his stuff for years, and it is good stuff. But I doubt he would ever come on our podcast. But one question I get is a lot of people are like quite skeptical about functional medicine, and it's still very aligned with allopathic or Western medicine. But when I say that, that's fine. But how do you explain the increases in chronic illnesses? I've got some stats here. Is that some estimate that there are at least 8 million people in the US with psoriasis, 4 million with Sjogren's disease. Why do you think there are so many more people suffering with chronic conditions?
Oh, it's a big question, isn't it? I think it's definitely a multi-pronged consideration. So we know, and what you say there, Rich, around sort of the West, I think that's really important to stress. There are some really interesting images that you can find on PubMed around, the prevalence of certain conditions by country. And you can see that there is an absolute theme with most of these kind of chronic complex conditions, especially the lifestyle driven ones, metabolic syndrome and diabetes and all various autoimmune conditions and things. And that you can't deny that the evidence shows us that lifestyle is a major driver of all of these. We hear all the time how our genetics haven't changed within this time period. We haven't evolved as a species suddenly. There has to therefore be an environmental driver of it. That could be dietary, that can be related to physical exercise, that can be related to environmental toxin exposures. I'm putting together a presentation at the moment all around sort of detoxification. So kind of have been in the research a little bit, and it is scary. Again, you cannot deny that we are living in an incredibly toxic world now. And we're getting more and more research showing us that these environmental toxins are having an impact on us humans. And if you want an extreme example, and people will critique this for that fact, but look at, for example, farmers on coffee sort of estates who are growing coffee beans, or farmers who are just exposed to the highest amount of pesticides, herbicides, etc., compared to you or I. And they have conditions at significantly higher levels than us that have been associated with that environmental exposure. So we know that environmental toxins is another one. A big bit in my clinical practice these days is mold-related illness. So people living in a water-damaged property where mold is now growing for various reasons related to ventilation and humidity levels. And they're breathing in these secondary metabolites from the mold that we call mycotoxins. And again, most of the research at this point in time is in animals. It is a huge problem within our food supply when we talk about mycotoxins, both for humans and animals. But I always like to kind of mention that because a big critique is always, there's almost no evidence on this stuff. And it's like, well, there's a bucket load. It's just not yet got to the point where we have a bucket load of it in humans, but it's coming. Dr. Jill Christer is doing a wonderful job of kind of achieving that, I guess, ultimately. But that's one example of these environmental toxins. Amalgam fillings would be another good example where we have evidence showing us that it compromises human health. And then you can go down more the Gabor Mate, Peter Levine, Bessel van der Kolk route of trauma and childhood adverse events that are associated with quite a lot of these conditions, IBS, chronic fatigue, fibromyalgia, autoimmune conditions. They've all been associated with traumatic events in childhood as well, ranging from emotional abuse to emotional neglect to physical abuse, physical neglect, witnessing violence, having a parent incarcerated. They're all associated with this. And that's a good example of how that one thing, adverse childhood events, can have an impact on our health as an adult 20, 30 years later. And even that can be through various mechanisms. So that could be biological, physiological, it could be relational, it could be social, it could be more sort of psychological. There's lots of different ways that these things influence how we interact with the world around us ultimately. Hence the term I mentioned earlier, the exposome, kind of this new thing, which is literally from the day we were conceived to now, everything we've breathed in, consumed, various metabolites we're producing in response to just having a metabolism. These are all part of this exposome. And I guess as technology is improving in the research and we start to use AI and all of these sorts of things, we're able to get a better understanding of this data. And actually, the more data we can have, in some ways, the better. But there's something like 150,000 chemicals that have been put in this earth in the last 50 years or so. So when we think of environmental toxin exposure, it is literally impossible to have any idea of our actual exposure to these things because you can't go and test for 150,000 chemicals. But what we do know is whether it's heavy metals, whether it is some of these pesticides, whether it's some of the compounds in plastics, they've all got research showing us that they're impacting things. So when you think about a root cause of a health issue, suddenly you've got to appreciate that is a massive challenge. It's a massive question. And this is why these days I prefer to think about, well, if we can just put lots of small positive inputs into your environment, we can start to shift physiology from a dysfunctional state, one that's lacking coherence, equilibrium, all of these kind of things, to one that now is more resilient and able to adapt to some of these environments. And the really exciting thing, my final point, is, we're starting to get sort of research around how certain mushrooms, certain bacteria seem to have an innate ability to actually deal with some of these environmental toxins that have been created by man, which is a pretty weird thing to kind of get our heads around, I think, as well.
Yeah, there's so much there, and the environmental stuff is it's so huge because there are so many insults to our body. I can remember, when you would go to a GP, they've got 10 minutes with you. Whereas when I went to a different functional medicine practitioner, they had a questionnaire that took like an hour to go through about my history. And one thing was like mold. Yes, mold you mentioned there. I knew mold was an issue at the time. Dave Asprey did a very good job of, letting people know how bad mold is. But one of the questions was, did you live near a golf course? And I lived on the back of a golf course. I would have golf balls flying into our garden. And I didn't realize the herbicides there can cause issues for people. And, the first 13 years of my life, I guess I'm inhaling herbicides, which could have been contributing to my gut issues.
And children are far more susceptible than adults to a lot of these sorts of environmental toxins, just from sort of a body weight to exposure sort of ratio. So yeah, that's interesting, Rich.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, go on, Andy.
No, I was just going to say, it all sounds pretty desperate in terms of the number of these things that are out there, and we don't even know what we're kind of consuming. And you hinted there are a few kind of positives to come out of it. Are there any kind of hacks and things that people could do immediately that might help with some of this?
Yeah, I think it's a good question. And I think there are. And the first thing around detox is reducing exposures. So, thinking about everything from your cosmetics and your toiletries to the products that you're cleaning your house with, to the things that you're cooking your food in, to the things that you're storing your food in. Now, one of the common things we'll hear is, eat as much organic as you can within your budget. I'm pretty sure there was a study that circulated recently. It was sort of observational in nature, I guess, to some degree, but it sort of suggested that actually just even non-organic fruit and veg may have a neutral, if not protective role to play, and that could be related to fiber. And we do have research showing us that sort of really looking after your microbiome is a very great way of reducing your exposure to some of these things, because our microbiome can bind and help detoxify some of these environmental toxins that we are being exposed to. So then you go down the gut health conversation of maybe consume some fermented produce, get your prebiotics in, make sure you're eating appropriate amounts of fiber, because that is, although amazingly controversial, fiber is pretty important for the gut microbiome, generally speaking. So yeah, there are lots of things that can be done. Step one, reduce your exposure. And things like that will also include opening up your windows, unless you're like directly on a very busy road, for example. But just ventilate, get better air quality, get the best air purifier that you can with the budget that you have. When you go and look at the research on indoor air pollution, again, it is pretty scary and depressing. So I do generally think that we should all have some kind of air purifier. And again, don't overthink it. Get the one that you can afford without breaking the bank at the end of the day.
What's the sort of price range we're talking about for an air purifier?
I mean, I think you can get a pretty decent one for a couple of £100. They go up to obviously thousands, because that's just reality these days. But I think, yeah, if you can get one for a couple of £100, I mean, we had a little mold problem in our kitchen. We just went to Which. I don't know I think it's probably just a UK thing, but we went there, got the best one, got the best ranking one that we could afford for a dehumidifier and an air purifier. And then we just left it there, because I have clients who literally will spend 3 months trying to decide which one to get, because there's so many options and they're being sold so many different sort of stories about the best product. So yes, and that's a symptom in its own right? That inability to actually make a decision is really a symptom that something's not quite right, maybe within the nervous system or somewhere. So I think even how we're, again, making these sorts of decisions and processes are all clues in regards to our well-being and our existence.
Yeah, I think the reason Andy asked that question is because things can get sort of overwhelming if we think about, gosh, how many things we have to do. And I think some people can get that sort of like, they just collapse, like, there's nothing I can do about it. But I think that attitude is maybe it's another symptom of their dysfunction or their illness. But hopefully we can encourage people to have, you don't have to do it all at once. It's a lifelong process. It's a journey of discovery, Absolutely. One step at a time.
Yeah, I think that's such an important message. And I love Dr. Tom O'Brien's sort of message there, which is he's like, whoever you are, you probably, if you really wanted to, could carve out an hour a week, spend an hour a week learning something about this, act upon it, and then that's you done for the week. So it might be that you go from today's conversation, you buy some glass Tupperware, So you can start storing your food in that. The next week, you search around an air purifier. The week after that, you change your toothpaste. Like, as you say, Rich, it's a lifelong process. We're learning, unlearning, relearning. I think a lot of the anxiety can come from thinking we've got to do it all now. The other weird thing that I think can sometimes be a little bit comforting is there isn't a direct correlation between an exposure and your health. So there are people walking down the high street who are pretty asymptomatic. They'll think they're in okay health, who might have a significantly elevated result for a certain environmental toxin, or they have something like if you tested is out of range. And you can have someone who is debilitated, who has a minor deviation within that same thing. So it's not as black and white as you have this much mercury in a blood test and therefore, oh my God, we've got to deal with this. It's got to be put within the context of that person. So I think that can be quite comforting sometimes to know that actually there are different ways that we can approach this. And that's one of the reasons why I really love this concept of just resiliency. Ultimately, what we're trying to do is all just get more resilient, because nature is incredibly resilient, obviously, and there's lots that we can learn from that perspective, I think, that are going to be helpful for us. And fundamentally, for us to be resilient, we need to get back to nature more. We started today talking a little bit about earthing as kind of one example of that, ultimately.
Yeah, the reason I mention that is not because I want to help people, but because I'm worried people will switch off the podcast when they hear how bad everything is. So stay with us, keep listening. But yeah, in terms of, I guess most people's first intervention would be diet. What's your kind of prescription for diet? What's your preferred diet? Is it FODMAPs? Is it carnivore? Is it keto? Is it vegan? Where do you stand?
So I've been thinking about this a little bit recently, because I was at a conference recently and they talked about like the FODMAP diet and they talked about some of the research. And the FODMAP diet, for listeners that might not be familiar with it, because I saw Andy about to, is essentially a low fermentable diet. So it's used a lot for people with irritable bowel syndrome when they're struggling with bloating and diarrhea. FODMAPs are rapidly fermentable carbohydrates found in things like leeks and onions and garlic and asparagus and all these foods that we're told are really good for us. And they are, unless we have some issues within our gut. Now, that could be an overgrowth of bacteria in the small intestine or something similar in the large intestine. So these kind of common imbalances that will lead to a diagnosis of IBS, which is a diagnosis of exclusion. You have these symptoms for this long. We can't explain it. You have IBS. That's literally kind of how it goes ultimately. But what we know is there are various things that can contribute to IBS. A lot of what we've been discussing is relevant for that. But yes, the FODMAP diet is reducing, sometimes avoiding these rapidly fermentable foods. And they are pretty much primarily in sort of plant matter. So fruits and veggies and grains, legumes, pulses, beans, the things that give most people flatulence to some degree, especially if they don't eat them very often. The problem is with this concept of diet is it's lacking context. You could have 10 different low FODMAP diets. You could have 10 different Mediterranean style diets. The carnivore diet is really the only one, I think, that actually tells you what that person's eating. So it's quite a good term from that perspective. But, you could be on a low fiber, low fruit veg, high protein, high fat FODMAP diet, or you could be really focusing on consuming lots of plants that are low in FODMAPs to really still try and support that microbiome. So it's really hard when we use the categorizations, I think, because there's so much variability that can be had within that same term, if that makes sense. And I know that's a really stupid response in some ways, but I think at the same time, it's quite important when we're listening to a conversation where someone's talking about the FODMAP diet and how it's, an antibiotic for your microbiome, which some of the research literally kind of calls it as. It's like, well, what were they actually eating? Because you've only told me what they're avoiding. You haven't actually told us what they're consuming. And that's kind of the really important part there. But in clinical practice, generally speaking, I don't do any diets per se these days. I'm normally and it's partly related to the type of clients I work with, admittedly, as well. They're kind of normally well into their health journey, having tried lots of things already. But it's normally a matter of saying, I would like you to keep the diet as diverse as possible within the context of your known or suspected intolerances, sensitivities, allergies, like reactions. Because most people coming to me have already done a lot of those diets. They've worked or haven't worked. And it's like we're actually left with just, this isn't a dietary thing. And I think this is a critique that I would have of the health space at the moment, which is it's so diet heavy, food heavy. And yes, food is really important, but there's a lot of people out there trying to improve their health and overcome some quite challenging stuff with kind of just food. And they're not really getting to the crux of what's causing that dysregulation within their mind and body. And in that situation, we need to build resilience. So we need to be often incorporating more things into the diet, get those herbs and spices back in, etc., etc. So I think these days, weirdly, even though I'm sort of a nutritional therapist, the diet is actually one of the smaller pieces that I deal with. But that is because of the type of client that generally comes to me these days. If someone's at the very beginning of their journey, they're coming to me, Alex, for the last 6 months, I've had loads of bloating and diarrhea, then yes, I will still probably consider reducing their FODMAP foods, those fermentable fibers, because it's an effective symptom management strategy, but it's not dealing with the underlying issues. So that's where, again, I think it's just really important for people to be aware of what is the purpose of this diet. And with the FODMAPs, it's symptom management. It's not root cause resolution. And it's not that's bad. That can be essential when someone's really struggling with bloating and diarrhea and things. But, it's a 6 to 8 week diet for symptom management while you address the underlying imbalances so they can then diversify the diet and tolerate those sorts of foods again.
Yeah, I think FODMAPs is the one diet I haven't done, so I am going to give that a try after I listened to a talk by Dr. Michael Ruscio at the Biohackers World. So I think I'm going to give that a try for a couple of weeks. But yeah, this stuff is so like bi-directional. What you eat affects your mental health, affects what you eat, and I feel like there's only one thing that the research sort of agrees on at the moment is that ultra-processed foods are the problem. I think that's the new hotness is ultra-processed foods, and I've got a little extract from a study or an article about a study that shows
Just
that.
Quickly, Rich, what are we categorizing as extra processed or ultra processed versus just processed?
Good question. I'll read this. I'll let Alex answer, and then I'll come back to you with a strict definition. So, across all age groups, the study found that eating extra processed goods results in much worse mental well-being. 60 to 70% of food eaten in the UK is extra processed, with over half of Brits eating it daily reported feeling distressed, compared to 18% who rarely or never do. Countries that scored the highest for well-being include poorer countries in Africa and Latin America, as well as the Dominican Republic, Sri Lanka, and Tanzania. And so over 500,000 people across 71 countries responded, with experts finding that low scores for richer countries were down to early age smartphone use and eating extra processed foods and loneliness. So the three things they're saying are causing all the mental health issues: smartphones, which kind of feeds into loneliness, plus this eating this extra processed food. So what's your take on that, Alex?
Yeah, I'm guessing, when we talk about ultra processed foods, biscuits, cookies, crisps, all of that kind of stuff, all the stuff that we know we need to be sort of limiting ultimately to some degree. But Rich, maybe you can give us a more technical definition of what they're talking about if you find it.
Yeah, I've got it. Yeah, so it's just ultra-processed foods are highly altered and typically contain a lot of added salt, sugar, fat, and industrial chemical additives. Okay,
there we go.
So yeah, it's probably a loose definition, but those types of things
Get the
you
idea.
just mentioned: biscuits, crisps, cake.
Yeah. And I think, as you say, it really is bi-directional. I shared it on the IFS podcast a couple of weeks ago, but I think our relationship with food just goes so deep, and it can be massively influenced by specific experiences that we've had, good or bad. It can be influenced by our relationship with our own physique and our looks. It can be influenced by our health. And I think, this idea with neuroplasticity, a lot of people out there have become hypervigilant, as I absolutely once was. I mentioned standing at the fridge for 20 minutes trying to figure out what to eat. That is a really primed nervous system, which is just on edge, like looking for threats all of the time. And If that's what it's doing, it's pretty much always going to find it. So you get yourself in this kind of really vicious cycle, I think, ultimately as well. But the thing I shared on the podcast was it wasn't that long ago, maybe a couple of months now. Actually, it was in my paternity leave. So Mum brought round an M&S sticky toffee pudding. I was like, thanks, Mum. That's just exactly what I need right now. But I don't know why this happened, but it did happen. And I was eating it, and I became it was very evident to me that I was not allowing myself to enjoy it, because it was an unhealthy food, one of these ultra processed foods. I had a narrative that it was going to trigger maybe some low level symptoms because of all of the sugar in it. And it was just like a bit of a eureka moment, which was, I'm not even aware of the fact until that point that I'm not giving myself permission to enjoy those things. And I honestly believe that as soon as you can switch that mindset, then you can start to enjoy those things without having some of the consequences that you're afraid are going to be happening in the first place. So, mindset is such a big one within the context of your relationship with food, especially when you've got some gut issues going on. And it was even things like becoming aware of how I was taking it off the spoon. You can think of maybe it's like a scene in a movie where someone's been really enjoying that dessert and like the lips are going all over it and they're embracing the experience. And I was doing the opposite. And then suddenly I was like, no, this is what's going to be contributing my symptoms, if anything. So it's just, I think that happens for a lot of us and in different ways, for different reasons, etc. But it's such a big one. And I'm passionate about that side of it these days, because so many people are going so deep down the rabbit hole of like, it's this one thing that's causing everything. And if I can fix it with the right supplement protocol or etc., I'll be fine. And we sometimes are just reinforcing the exact thing that we're trying to resolve ultimately.
Yeah, I think that intersection between bodily issues, gut issues, and mental health is a kind of the new frontier. Medicine has been so siloed, and even functional medicine gets siloed. But that intersection is something I really want to explore. And just going away with Andy, leaving my home, my gut issues were way improved. And as soon as I come back home, even though I've got a lovely home, very little stress, biohacked in every way, just being in my house, knowing that this is where I work, my gut issues come right back. So yeah, and that's not just this home as well. That used to happen to me in Hammersmith or things like that. So yeah, it's something I want to learn more about.
I think I just put you at ease, Rich, basically.
Yeah, that was it. Yeah, that's it. Yeah, can you move back in, and you'll be my symptom manager.
I always go to this point, Alex, but what would a client like yours look like, or why would someone look to kind of, it sounds like it's almost like an end of the road thing, I've tried everything else and now maybe I should look at some of this stuff. But I mean, there are probably plenty of people listening who think, actually I've been responding badly to this and that. Are there any tests you can do or forms you can fill out? Can you tell a bit more about that?
Yeah, I mean, there are almost countless tests out there these days. I think, and that's not necessarily a good thing for various reasons, in regards to everything from making the decision to what test to do, to how they're regulated and the validity behind the test even sometimes, or the technology being used, etc. But you can go these days and do all sorts of different tests. We can look at nutrient status, we can look at hormone status, hormone metabolism. You can go and look at various inflammatory markers. Most people are familiar with the ideas of leaky gut and the gut microbiome. You can look at the blood-brain barrier now to see whether that's leaky, because that's another thing that leaks sometimes.
How do you look at that?
That's a blood test. It's looking at antibodies to certain proteins from memory. So, and there's, more and more out there. I think the really important question to ask, if you're thinking about doing really any test to some degree, is it actually going to change what I need to do? Because it's so easy to spend money on a test and actually not really change the plan that a practitioner might put in place for you. So if you're not doing the foundations, really start there. And I think we all have that mindset really, which is that new, shiny, expensive thing has got to work because it's new, shiny and expensive. But actually, if you're not moving your body appropriately, if you're not eating an appropriate diet, if you're not working and being mindful about your relationships, if you're not getting enough sunlight, even when it's not sunny, if you're not doing a bit of grounding, etc., there are so many little things that over time will make a profound difference. And what I would say is a lot of people coming to me who have spent a lot of money, have been struggling for a long time, they aren't actually doing a lot of those foundations. And I think what happens, and I totally get it, but I think what happens is, you start with a broad perspective of life, and you have your friends, your social life, you're going to the gym, you've got work, you start to develop health issues, and it's just like a funnel. Life starts to get narrower and narrower. The bloating means you don't feel comfortable going out with your friends anymore. You can't drink alcohol because it makes you feel even worse than just a normal hangover, etc., etc. And I just think people get to a point whereby life is now so small that actually, again, this is compounding their whole health situation. And the research is very clear that we are social creatures. We need to engage in life. And the problem, I think, that sometimes can arise is our health issues are the reasons we're giving for not living. But if we're not living, we're going to have health issues. And there's this paradox that we have to kind of handle both simultaneously, which is, I totally understand you're really struggling and you're suffering and you don't want to go out for these reasons, but we need you to start diversifying again. And I'm trying to come up with like a metaphor and an analogy or something, but the only way I can think about it is, your life force. And that kind of think about it as an inflatable balloon or something. We're just trying to get life back into the system and get you engaging again in life. And I think sometimes that's a really important part of this process. And, there are times I had a discovery call yesterday with a wonderful lady, but within 10 seconds, I could tell you that where she needed to go, because, you could feel the stress, the anxiety, etc. there. And we had a really great half hour talking about, some of the stuff that we're talking about now. But that's a very specific type of person. So someone who might not be down the funnel, who might be at the beginning and maybe, let's say, at risk of going down the funnel, then yes, that's where I think working with a practitioner who has a broad awareness rather than a deep awareness of stuff can be helpful to begin with. And then if you find something out, like you have a positive mycotoxin test, meaning that you've likely been exposed to a water damage property with mold, maybe that's when you go and work with a practitioner who really kind of knows their stuff in that area. But I think we kind of need more generalists. Like in conventional medicine, we have GPs. I think we need more functional medicine sort of GPs who have that breadth of understanding that you're not going to fix your health just through the typical functional medicine lens. We do need to bring sort of spirituality back into the model, and we do need to be thinking about relationships and your values and your purpose. All of that stuff is driving your health or driving disease ultimately. So yeah, I don't know if that answered your question or not.
It very much does. Yeah.
Well, yeah, one of the things over here I looked into was naturopathic doctors. We don't really have them in the UK, or they're just naturopathic practitioners. Whereas here, they're recognised as. I looked at going to naturopathic medical school.
What does that mean, Rich?
So it's like holistic medicine, effectively,
Okay.
but it is like a medical degree. It's like a 5-year degree. I didn't do it because I'm quite squeamish, and it involves cutting up cadavers and doing small surgeries and doing IVs and things like that. So they get proper training, and they're in most states in the US, they are recognized as doctors, but we don't have that in the UK. And I think that's a shame because, general practitioners, as wonderful as they are and as many lives as they save, they are siloed and they are not generalist enough, as you say, Alex.
Yeah. I think we have them on the continent. I think naturopathy, kind of origins from Germany and the like, I think naturopathy, doesn't it?
It does, yeah. You mentioned leaky gut, and one of your newsletters had a catchy title, Leaky Gut, Real or Fake? So
I don't even remember that one.
What's the answer?
It is 100% real. Like there's just no denying it. It amazes me that on the NHS website, they still talk about it as this like fictional thing that isn't real. And you go and look at the research, and yes, it absolutely is. And there are different terms that will be used in the research. So there are some papers that will use the kind of informal term of leaky guts. Intestinal permeability is a slightly more kind of technical or formal term, but there's also this idea of metabolic endotoxemia, which is again really kind of talking about this idea of leaky guts. And it absolutely is real and is something that, we need to be mindful about. I think, again, one of the common misconceptions is, oh, I found out I have leaky gut, so I'm going to take my L-glutamine and zinc carnosine and I'll be better again after a month or two. Leaky gut is a symptom of something, and therefore you could argue is less important than other things that will be going on for your health if you have it. And I do think that's a really important concept for people to appreciate, because again, people go down the rabbit hole of leaky gut and end up taking 10 different supplements for their gut lining, but they still have a completely dysregulated microbiome, or their stress levels are through the roof, or whatever it may be. So yes, it's real. And, we have studies in humans showing us that a 10K run done at a kind of competitive pace induces short-term leaky gut. So the other thing to appreciate is we all have leaky gut at times. It's what they call selectively permeable. So it's allowing some stuff through, electrolytes, amino acids and nutrients, etc., and preventing other stuff getting through, partially undigested foods, remnants of bacteria, dead bacteria, and these kinds of things. But yeah, you eat and you're going to have a little bit leakier gut. You exercise too much and you're going to have a little bit of leaky gut. But the body's got that capacity to regenerate. And as many people might have heard, the cells that line the gut are the fastest to regenerate out of anywhere in the body, 3 to 5 days. So I also like to tell clients that I like to tell them that, because it's like, okay, well, actually, if you address the underlying issue, in 3 to 5 days, you're going to have a shiny new gut lining. You don't necessarily need the glutamine, the zinc carnosine. They can be helpful at times, don't get me wrong, but I think it's just important to appreciate, again, like the FODMAP diet, there are Band-Aids. You're kind of literally putting a plaster on the gut lining to sort of reduce the leakiness. And that can have a noticeable impact on some conditions quite quickly. In my experience, definitely skin conditions, like give someone some glutamine, zinc carnosine sometimes, and because you're putting that Band-Aid up, their symptoms start to calm down relatively quickly sometimes. So yes, I guess the answer is yes.
It's real. Okay. Yeah, that was what you're saying there about exercise and gut motility or permeability. It really strikes a chord with me, because when I do like a CrossFit competition, that's all day. Often as a celebration, we'll go to In-N-Out Burger or somewhere terrible. But it also makes me think about, as a kid, after a rugby match, you would get probably more some intestinal permeability, and then you'd get your penguins and your clubs and your hot dogs and your donuts. So it's like we're creating this intestinal permeability and then feeding our children with like the most toxic foods possible. And I reckon years of doing that probably contributed to my
that'll do it.
yeah. Well, another thing you mentioned on your podcast, that you were at a conference and apparently one doctor stood up and said probiotics do not work. Yes. What's your take on probiotics then?
Yeah, I think that's just not true. Like, we've got good research showing us probiotics are effective. I guess the question becomes, the finer details always matter with this stuff, right? So what's the question being asked? Like, what are you asking? Is this probiotic working? Are we talking about something specific? Are we looking at the right things? So with probiotics, it might be worth just taking a step back for a second and appreciating that probiotics have to be selected for strain specificity and disease specificity, meaning you should choose a probiotic for a specific purpose and because of a specific diagnosis that someone has. Now, that's not to say that you can't take a broad spectrum probiotic that's got a bunch of random bacteria in it, but it's a bit more potluck. That might work in regards to whatever you're kind of trying to improve, but it might not. But we know that there are specific strains of bacteria that do have a much, let's say, greater chance of working for the thing that you're trying to achieve. So if someone's got elevated methane in a breath test confirming a diagnosis called intestinal methanogen overgrowth, so basically they have an overgrowth of these methane-producing organisms somewhere in their gut, we know that a probiotic called Lactobacillus reuteri DSM 17938 is the only probiotic that has evidence in reducing methane. But it's that 17938 that is important. And I'm terrible with this sort of stuff, but I use a car analogy. You have a Ford Fiesta 1.4. So that's sort of like Lactobacillus reuteri, Lactobacillus reuteri DSM 17938. So there are three criteria to identify what probiotic you're taking. And ideally, you need to know all three of those bits of criteria. Now it's getting better and better, but if you walk into a health food store on the high street, you will absolutely find probiotics on the shelf that don't tell you that third bit of criteria, meaning you don't actually know what probiotic you're taking and whether actually it's a probiotic or not. There's research, this is just so depressing. There's research showing us that if you take a bottle of probiotics and you get it analyzed, there are bacteria, let's get this right, there are bacteria in the product that aren't on the label, and there are bacteria on the label that aren't in the product. And this is why it's really important to choose good quality brands. And annoyingly, some of them are practitioner only, which I don't really like the concept of really, but I understand why they do it. But you certainly want to, with probiotics, be able to see 3 tiers of information for it. And really you want to be finding out what strain is good for what I'm trying to achieve. Is there one, for starters? But the likely is there are good strains for diarrhea, constipation, bloating, anxiety, depression, leaky guts, etc. So that's a really important thing to appreciate. And yes, we've got good quality evidence showing us that they work. The problem is, are we asking a good enough question? Are we looking at the right sort of outcome from the study? Because if you just throw a bunch of probiotics and say, does this reduce inflammation? Well, that's not a particularly good study. So that's where I think, again, the context really matters with this stuff.
Well, I mean, HealthPath is a testing company, right? That's one of its main functions. And this is one of the reasons I trust you, Alex, is you're not trying to push the tests. You said, testing can have issues, but when is testing a good idea and what kind of tests do you do?
Yeah, at HealthPath, what test do we do?
Yeah.
So at HealthPath, we do a gut microbiome test where we're looking at bacteria, parasites, yeasts, and what we call archaea. These are the kind of the methane producing organisms in the large intestine. And it also looks at sort of what I just call digestive capacity. So it's looking at, do you have elevated amounts of digestive residues in the stool? So do you have too much fat, sugar, protein, and what's going on with the water content of the stool? Because the water content of the stool is a really good marker for transit time. So how quickly stuff's traveling through the colon, basically. It looks at inflammatory markers like calprotectin. So that's a marker that will differentiate between inflammatory bowel disease and autoimmune condition from irritable bowel syndrome, which often will get categorized as like a functional condition. And we look at something called secretory IgA, which is a mucosal immune marker. And your mucosal immune system lines the inner lining of your digestive tract and is arguably the most important part of your body ultimately. Because, bear in mind that the inside the digestive tract is the outside world. We have a hollow tube that goes through us, and that lining, that's why leaky gut is such a big thing, because we need that lining to be appropriately selectively permeable. When it becomes too leaky, stuff from the outside is able to get in, which is associated with a lot of stuff, I guess, put simply. But we also do SIBO testing, small intestine bacterial overgrowth. So this is thought to be quite a common cause of irritable bowel syndrome, but has also been associated with a lot of systemic conditions. So quite a high percentage of people with various autoimmune conditions have been found to have SIBO. So there's this real like chicken and egg argument. SIBO is secondary to something else, is the consensus. The question is, well, why do you have it? Is there a motility issue? Do you have issues with your digestive capacity? So stomach acids. We've got a really acidic stomach. It should be, it can be as low as 1 or 2, and it increases a little bit at mealtime when stuff enters the stomach. But it should be highly acidic, and that acidity is partly there to kill off bacteria that we're swallowing. Our oral microbiome, the microbiome in our mouth, which is the second most abundant microbiome. And again, it's kind of like the new gut microbiome. There's an explosion of research around the importance of the bacteria and everything else in our mouth. But the question is, what's caused that SIBO in the first place? So it's kind of the middleman. It's good to know because there are risk factors associated with having SIBO, and it also drives a lot of very frustrating symptoms like the bloating, the diarrhea, potentially the constipation, etc. We do food sensitivity testing. It's not something I love, I have to say. It's arguably one of the more controversial areas. However, we do have randomized controlled trials showing us that food sensitivity testing can be helpful in specific situations. And
is that through the blood as well, Alex?
That's a finger prick blood
Finger
test.
prick,
Yeah. The SIBO test is a breath test.
Yep.
So with SIBO, what you're doing is you're taking either a lactulose or a glucose solution after a fast. The fast is there to try and get rid of all the bacteria that kind of shouldn't be there, so to speak, in the small intestine. You then take this sugary solution, you take breath samples every 15 to 20 minutes for up to 3 hours, depending on the test. And then we're looking at the level of hydrogen or methane gas that is detected in your breath. And if that's over a threshold, that's how we diagnose kind of SIBO and EMO, as I call it, intestinal methanogen overgrowth, which is the kind of the constipation end of it. It's probably IMO might be a better one, but I think EMO is more fun. What else do we do? And we do a cortisol salivary test looking at kind of adrenal function, this idea of adrenal fatigue, which doesn't exist when we think about it in the way that it's been discussed most frequently. But salivary cortisol is a very valid marker. There's a huge amounts of research on sort of salivary cortisol. Cortisol, most of us think of as a stress hormone, which obviously it is, but it also has a really important role to play within our immune system. You know, it's a potent anti-inflammatory hormone. Think of corticosteroids that we might get prescribed. They come from the cortisol fundamentally. So I think that's important to appreciate because it starts to change how we interpret salivary cortisol adrenal testing. So if you have chronically low levels of cortisol in a saliva test, that's the kind of the old school, oh, you've got adrenal fatigue. You've been so stressed for so long that those adrenal glands that sit on your kidneys are burnt out and they can no longer produce enough cortisol. That's not necessarily accurate. What could be happening is a dysregulation between the brain and the adrenals. So people might have heard the term the HPA axis, the hypothalamus, pituitary, adrenal axis. So the hypothalamus is communicating to the pituitary, communicates to the adrenals, listen, and then produce appropriate amounts of cortisol dependent on what they're being told. So that kind of communication highway can get compromised for various reasons. But also a theory that has been published is that it's related to maybe something like a chronic infection, creating a chronic inflammatory state, and your body's going into an adaptive response where it's saying, we can't get rid of this thing. Let's lower cortisol to free up your immune system to have a more aggressive approach at dealing with this infection. Because if you lower cortisol, and cortisol's anti-inflammatory, you literally are freeing up parts of your immune system to be more aggressive and do it. And this is something that you do see. You know, a theme in the research is low cortisol output in salivary testing in people with chronic fatigue syndrome. And a theme is elevated free cortisol in depression. Having said that, we also see in the research that these things vary based on the context. It's a stress hormone. So what happens if you have a nightmare the night before doing your test? Well, that has been shown to influence it. What happens if you've got a stressed meeting coming up that day and you have anticipatory stress? That's going to influence it. So we can't say definitively that if you do one test, this is what your cortisol levels are going to be like every day for the next few days, weeks, months. It's going to vary. But interestingly, for other people, it will be stuck. It will be stagnant. It will be the same repeatedly. And this goes back to this idea of allostasis, adaptability, resiliency. When people when they get unwell, one of the things that can happen, and this isn't the only thing, it's important to, I guess, say, but one of the things is, the way I think about it is physiology gets entrenched. It gets stuck in a specific pattern, and then we've lost the ability to adapt. It can go the other way as well, where physiology is kind of just going all over the place. There's no stability there. And sometimes people will repeat a test and their results are just completely different, not just for cortisol, but that could be for other things as well. So it's almost like at either end of the spectrum, you've got sort of a really stagnant physiology and one that's just going haywire, that's lost all sense of stability, so to speak. So yeah, I think, those are the tests we offer. We also have HealthPath Pro. So within HealthPath Pro, we've got now, I think, over 90 tests, but HealthPath Pro is a kind of practitioner platform. So we have a database of practitioners on HealthPath. So if you're looking to work with a practitioner now, you can go to HealthPath. You can search our database by speciality. If you want someone who specializes in hormones or gut stuff, etc., people can find a practitioner that kind of resonates. They all offer discovery calls, which I think is really important. There's even research showing us that the most important variable in healing is nothing to do with the protocol or the medication even. It is the therapeutic relationship. So, you've got to connect with the person that is supporting your health journey. And that's why I think it's really important to, have those chats and conversations for both parties ultimately.
Yeah, that's the same kind of research in psychotherapy. The most important, valuable metric for success in mental health is the relationship between the therapist and the client. So it's interesting that's the same there. But yeah, well, thank you so much, Alex. I've learned a lot. I'm sure Andy's.
I've learned even more
too, as well. Yeah.
And no, thanks for giving us such a fascinating insight into your wellness work and some glimmers of hope to counter the 150,000.
There are lots of glimmers of hope, and as I think Rich made the great point, just chip away, spend the rest of the year just chipping away, doing little things, and you'll be fine.
You'll be fine in the end. Yeah. So where do we find you, Alex?
So my website is alexmanos.co.uk. The Health Path website is just healthpath.com. I'm not particularly prominent on social media these days at the moment, but my Instagram is where I'm at primarily, and that's Alexander Manos is my sort of IG handle. And it's the Health Path podcast, which I currently sort of do when I can. So yeah, those are where you can find me, I think.
Awesome.
Brilliant. Where do they find us, Rich?
Where they find us at Laughing Through the Pain, Navigating Wellness. RichardLblake.com is my website. You can also find the podcast there. I am at The Breath Geek on Instagram. Andy is Andy Esam on Instagram. And yeah, listener, please like, subscribe, leave us a review, and message us as well. We're very open. If you've got questions, send me a DM and we'll address it on the podcast. So
yes,
thank you, Alex. Thank you, Andy, and
thank
you, listener.
Before we go, I think we should probably just issue an apology to In-N-Out Burger as well, which is far from terrible.
It is good
so
stuff.
Sorry about that.
Yeah, it is indeed. Okay, sorry, In-N-Out Burger.
Thanks again. Bye.
Cheers. Bye-bye.